All right, look, next speaker today, we have Lachie Sutton from Nala Agribusiness. Lachie is a local consultant and producer based down in Wentworth and servicing the broader Far West. He brings with him a wealth of experience and knowledge across a number of commodity types and production systems. And today is going to be talking about EID and the use of that as a tool to capture production data in your livestock enterprise and use that to assist in decision making and I guess drive some well-informed and tactical decisions. Thanks, Lachie.
Thanks, Mitch, and thanks to MLA for letting us come up and have a chat to everyone today. So I know a fair few of you in the room from my wool broking days. So I had around 10 years marketing wool and livestock throughout Eastern Australia, which explains my receding hairline a fair bit, and then sort of finished up my last posting was here in the Western Division. So our business is based down in Wentworth, myself and my wife, and we focus on farm production consulting, but we've got a really big part of our business is through data. So we've got clients ranging from citrus and table grapes in our local Mildura district right up to broadacre cropping, brought in through northwest Victoria and right up to rangeland grazing. So it's always good to be back up here. Always feel a lot more at home coming back because I'm sort of really passionate about the area and the upside in this area is as good as anything I see in any of the enterprises we work with. So I'm going to be talking about EID obviously today, and I'll be speaking to you from a consultative basis, but also as a producer. We've got a small flock, around a couple of thousand DSEs we run north of Wentworth and on a few other lease blocks. And starting out, I've made almost every mistake I think you can make with EID. Compared to where we are now to where we started are two completely different things. So please keep that in mind as you work through. So let's have a show of hands. Has anyone sort of invested much money into the technology or anything in the room, or is it all, yep, so a few. So it's for those who are cattle producers, you're told by the government that you have to do it, but with sheep, it's obviously still a voluntary system. So, but a great bit of opportunity. So an EID system, it's an individual management system. So rather than looking at the mob, we're looking at the individual animal and trying to monitor that animal on a performance evidence-based methodology throughout its life. So usually for this, like we're focusing on an electronic tag and then ways of measuring and capturing data throughout the system. So instead of historically in a self-replacing merino flock, we might have looked at that animal once in its life at a 1.5, and that set us up for the future. We're trying to manage and better tailor and precision, get better precision in our decision making. So again, similar to ASBVs and everything else, it's here to help the decision maker. It's not the be all and end all. And I think a lot of the time, and particularly myself in my own experience, we sort of thought that it was going to really help drive a lot more decisions than what it did. It's just an aid, and we've got to keep bringing into it to everything else within our production system. So we focus on measuring the individual within the mob to help improve the overall livestock business. So if we've got, say, a merino ewe, and I apologise, I'll focus on sheep mostly today because that's most of my background, that we'll look at her and we might be trying to find trade-offs between wool, fertility, growth rates, maternal characteristics and everything like that to try and improve the overall business. So I always stress pretty heavily with our clients and as well throughout the rest of the presentation that nothing happens in isolation in a business. So if we focus on one trait too much, and then we might miss some other traits. So if we focus on breeding the heaviest cutting ewe in Australia, chances are she's probably not going to rear 150% lambs year in, year out. So trying to do that, there's individuals out there that might be able to do that, but without doing it this way, it's quite difficult to be able to do it objectively and consistently throughout the time. So we can draw data out. I mean, I'll go through what a system looks like in a second, but we can draw data out in a certain number of ways through different bits of software, spreadsheets or other formats. So there's that many different new products coming out there at the moment. It's quite confusing, but it's quite good as well. And we can obviously use it in sheep, cattle and goats. So we're doing everything at the moment, predominantly in sheep and goats, and increasingly in goats with guys doing individual management systems. So this is what basically a system looks like and how we explain it. So we've got 3 key points for me. So the data collection, which can range from everything like a Gallagher flash UV setup from Tim Goal, who's using that at the moment out at Canamble, right through to just a simple stick reader. And I will warn you, if you ever do buy one of these, don't take them on a plane on your carry-on or anything like that because you will get pulled up thinking it's a Tommy gun. Something simple like that. So around $2,000 right through to tens of thousands. So you don't need to spend a lot to make a big difference within your business. So we focus on the data collect, and depending on what trait we're looking at, it might be wet and drying ewes, it might be at scanning, it might be carrying through our maternal traits. So we collect that data, then we have to go through and look at what it's actually telling us. So for this example here, this was on the board, not that you can really see it, but it was a condition score versus pregnancy status at a Dorper enterprise in the rangelands. So we've gone through and we've had a look at it, and we've said, okay, we know how many ewes are in condition score 2, 3s, 4s, some up into 5s, how many are in lamb, what our demand on our feed on offer is going to be like in the next few months. And then we aim to make a management decision with it. So that visual's an auto drafter interface, which Seth touched on earlier on today, but that management decision could simply be that we keep that ewe because she's a really high performer, or we get rid of her because she's gotten in lamb, but she hasn't been able to maintain that lamb 2 years in a row. So for those of you that know me, I focus a lot on fertility and being the biggest profit driver in our business, whether you're breeding oranges or sheep. So aims, we want to make evidence-based decisions. So, I mean, when a lot of the time, and I was guilty of this when I was sheep classing a lot of the time, you turn up at a 1.5-year-old group of young merino ewes and you look through and you sort of bring in some of your more subjective and experience base into that process. But this is still a part of that system, but then it's actually building it and building that picture throughout the ewe or the female's lifetime in particular, and then right through to how they're producing. So instead of just sitting there, so we might take it and then we'll go to the scanning, and then we'll have, okay, so she hasn't gotten in lamb, so she might be one we get rid of, or she's gotten in lamb and she hasn't been able to hold it right through to lamb marking. So, and sometimes these are pretty complex scenarios. I mean, it can get pretty out of hand pretty quickly when you start playing around with data too much. I'll just jump to the next slide quickly, but it's just 3 traits over about 10 or a dozen ewes there, and by the time you start doing that through multiple years, you start to get into tens of thousands of data sets quite quickly. So it's so for me, it's sometimes trying to keep it simple, but we're trying to capture what is a complex and a lot going on in some of these enterprises. So plan for the key production opportunities and challenges. So when we look at it, I mean, we look at how well are we utilising our feed on offer. Like, have we got a ewe that, yeah, she looked great as a 1.5, but we've got her at 5 years old and she hasn't reared a lamb, she hasn't done it, she's cutting an extra half a kilo of wool, but do we keep her on at the expense of another ewe who might be a couple of years older, who's rearing 2 lambs year in, year out, she's still managing to cut maybe a kilo less, but she's just one of your high-performing ewes. So if we were going to take a ewe, and particularly when we get into a drought condition, if we're going to be trucking our sheep or feeding or maintaining ground cover, whatever we're trying to do, we need to be doing that with our highest performing females in particular. So it's a bit like sending sort of me off to university when I've really got no hope of getting a degree, but I'm going to go there for 4 years and drink and carry on and play footy and not really achieve much at the end. And that's what we do a little bit, I think, with some of our sheep and cattle when we send them around. We manage the individuals while also managing the flocks. So I'm a pretty big fan of scanning and again, keeping on coming back to the fertility picture. But I think particularly up here in the rangelands, when we have extensive joining periods a lot of the time, and I think that can create a few headaches. I know if anyone who's picking up lambs in some of these areas, like it can create a pretty big back problem alone as well as a headache. But if we can early and late our ewes, we can separate them out year in, year out and just manage how they're being manipulated a little bit. So I think key is sort of some of the decision making, sort of not so much when we capture the data, but how we use it after. So if we're up here and we're joining for 12 weeks, and we know that by the time we get to a 12-week lamb in a good season, when we can actually get them in and mark them, they're going to be pretty heavy lambs. And then vice versa, once we get through into weaning, we can separate those earlier droppers. We can get the lambs off their mums a lot earlier, and then we can let that ewe get back up into a better joining condition score, which could keep contributing through to increase fertility and then fleece weights for those guys in the wool industry. And importantly, measuring the response to what we're doing. I mean, it's if we're out there and we've scanned 150% in lamb, and then we're getting to lamb marking and we're only marking 80%, something's gone drastically wrong. So we can start to say, well, all right, I might have put them all into a paddock that really didn't have much feed, or it had a high amount of dry matter and very low energy. So this is why I've dropped off, and this is how much it's cost me. So, and vice versa. I mean, in our in our Dorper enterprise at home, like we're pretty strong on maintaining condition score of the ewes and feeding and making sure that what we're doing is contributing to our sheep increasing body weight and condition score to try and get her back in lamb as quickly as possible. So I mean, this is just a pretty standard. So we look at 3 simple traits there. So we've got body weight on the left-hand side, pregnancy status, and greasy fleece weight. So if we look, we've got a variety of ewes. So the average 65.82, 1.33, 7.98, and these aren't real data sets. This was just done after a couple of glasses of red one night, so don't read too much into it. So if we look at that and we look at the data in raw form, it can start to get pretty confusing. So once we get through it, we start to index and we see that these ewes up here, we've got some that are higher value on there with body weight and maintaining through on pregnancy status and right through into combine our index with fleece weight. So in this instance, the growers put a 30% weighting on their body weight, 50% weighting on their pregnancy status and 20% on greasy fleece weight. So using the EID data, we can understand which ones are the highest performers throughout the enterprise and select ewes to maintain in our system based on those. And that's how we do it with a lot of multi-traits and throughout the generations throughout the years of the ewe. I want to stress, use the data that you've already got before you kick into gear. We don't use things like kill sheets and wool test and weight loss well a lot of the time, and we've got a lot of data out there that we don't really effectively use. I mean, I just ask yourself, when was the last time you used a kill sheet? When was the last time you did a time series of marking or weaning percentages? I want to stress, you want to do, why are we going to measure? Don't just try and measure everything. That was one of the mistakes we made at the start, was we tried to measure too much, and we still do a little bit just because that's what we like to do. But try and measure, realise you don't need to conquer the world, just focus on some simple traits. And I mean, you can spend everything from $2,000 on that right up to 30 or 40 grand in auto draft technology to implement your program and match your CapEx to your framework. So if you've got a bit of a strategic plan for your EID, match what your expenditure is going to be as well. Make sure you understand your key profit drivers, so fertility for me, and within the whole business context. So you look at both sides of the P&L and think about your feed on offer and other constraints within the business. As I sort of said, investment can vary significantly. Tags around $1.50 for the ones I've got down here, right up to some of your auto draft technologies. So you don't need to spend a lot to get meaningful results. I mean, it's we sort of start out with $2,000 reader, so which is pretty cost effective. Utilise your existing resources, scanners, agents. They're all set up for EID. Utilise them. They're already in your business. It's good another opinion some of the time to have in to help you, and remember that technology gets better every day. Remember the context of where we are. You probably don't want to be getting sheep in every week in the rangelands to monitor weight gains, but we do have them coming through at land mark and everything else. So capture the data when you're already handling the sheep, and don't try and overdo it too much, and don't sweat the imperfections. You're going to get a lot of misreads. Tags are getting better. Like the tags we use now are much better than what we first started, but that was one of the frustrations of not being perfect through the whole system. And remember that nothing happens in isolation in a grazing system. So if we pull one lever, chances are something else is going to happen. So try and keep it in total context. On the too much data, I get that asked a lot of the time. So with our cropping clients, we're dealing with guys that have got 1 million data sets per year sometimes, and it does get pretty easy to get paralysis by analysis a lot of the time. And so just try and simplify that through the process and get people involved. You don't need to do it all yourself. You wouldn't shear all your sheep yourself, so don't be scared to get other people into the business to try and help you do that. I think for me that the way to simplify the data is just to use indexes and put different weightings on for what meets your breeding objectives. Don't go through each individual row and try and find that ewe or that cow that meets what you want her to be able to do. I won't go through the demonstration in time because we're almost out of time, aren't we? What we got? Yeah. So I mean, I'll just show you what some of the data sets look like. So this is virtually this bag of tags here is represented in those numbers up there. So, and this is more a red wine example than a real world example, but you can see how quickly we can start to build a picture around that ewe, and we can look at the data in a lot of different ways. So on this example up there, we've got fleece weight, we've got pregnancy status, micron, condition score, and early versus late. And that can sort of aid how we adjust for each of those individual ewes and how we make our breeding decisions. We can look at it in summary form. So again, that same amount of data, by the time we collate it, goes back into here, all just from a few EID tags put into a handful of ewes. But I mean, particularly I like to look at the variance within the flock and try and identify those top performers as well as the bottom performers to try and meet our objectives. And again, looking at it through different forms, how our distributions are. So fibre diameter and condition score, particularly once you start to build big data sets, it can get really quite interesting at the minute level with condition scoring and how many ewes or nannies or whatever you need to still get back up to maintain and achieve your potential fertility. So the main things is you don't require a significant investment to get started. As I said, I'd highly recommend if you were going down the path, focus on getting the tags into a certain age group, getting a stick reader and going from there. You don't need to go and spend $30,000 on an auto drafter to get started. It is really good with labour constraints and whatever else, but you've got to start somewhere. Utilise the data that you have around you and the people that you already have around you. So again, we've got plenty of people out there with the technology. I mean, every agent's got a set of scales. Most pregnancy testers have a panel reader now. And that's just ways of just utilising other people within your existing business to leverage what they're offering you already. You don't need to take on the world to make a start. With most of our clients, we usually sort of start around that fertility story and pick a point and move forward from there. But again, I think you've got to have a really clear strategic framework in what you're doing. So if you're aiming to, and set quantifiable targets, don't just say I want to increase my fertility. Say I want to increase sort of my weaning rates by 5% per year over the next 5 years, and make sure they're really well defined. And that way the rest of your actions will flow through. So things like targeting condition scores, weaning times, whatever else. And again, make sure nothing happens in isolation. So it's if we focus on, and the wool industry did this really well through the 90s, and when they were focusing on dropping micron, that we got our micron down, but we lost our constitution, we lost our structure, we lost our fleece weight, and then we spent the next 20 years after that trying to get all those things back. And I think that's the same within an enterprise as well, that if we focus too much on one particular thing, that we can lose other things around it that don't necessarily, that can actually bring back what we're trying to achieve. So there's a few extra tools and resources there. I mean, come up and have a chat over a beer later on. It's there's a fair bit going on in this space at the moment, and same with Shane. Sort of, there seems to be a new bit of software, a new bit of technology coming out every day. So feel free to come up and have a bit of a chat after today. Any questions? Oh, do we? Right.
Straight to questions.
Yeah.
Lachie's cracked through that one, so we've got plenty of time for questions. If anyone's got any, just give me a chance to get to you so we can get it on the recording. Back.
You've talked a lot about the sheep, and I know you say that's where you specialise. In terms of goats, have you got any feedback on people who have used the system, and has it worked for them? Is it beneficial to look into doing it for the goat industry?
Yeah, definitely. So we're not so much doing the data collect side. We do a lot of data analysis now with the goats, and probably two things that's shown us is one, the amount of potential upside just through the variance in the industry we've found. Like it's sort of, there's some really, really high performing animals out there, and there's some really, really low performing. So as you'd expect when they've evolved in a rangeland by natural selection, really. But yeah, definitely same applies across sheep and goats, really, as far as I'm concerned. So, but I'm probably as much excited about goats and the potential for it as I am about sheep, to be honest, just because there's so much upside in that industry, I believe.
Other questions?
Not so much questions as something to maybe get your comment on. One is tag technology and retention and stuff. Obviously, we've been using EID since 2014 and been through a few tag suppliers in that time and settled on one. I don't particularly want to bash brands, but I don't know whether I'm allowed to. Have you got any comment there?
Yeah, about the same thing. So we the first lot we did, I won't bash brands, but they were terrible. And I mean, particularly in a Dorper flock, for some reason we just were losing 5-10% in a mob. So we've since moved to shearwell tags, the same as Andrew, and the results have been fantastic. They're sort of seem to be a lot flatter and not as hoopy as some of the other brands, and especially if you've got a ewe or whatever that's in there burrowing underneath a bit of stick to grab some feed, it doesn't seem to. We don't lose as many, and we don't lose as many even putting them in. And I know that those guys are starting. They haven't actually had a multi-tagger, but I saw one on Saturday that looks pretty good. So highly recommend those guys at the moment. And the same with a lot of the technology. I know some guys that were really early adopters of EID and probably went away from it because the technology wasn't talking to each other. Like, I mean, you mentioned today when you're talking about Stockbook and trying to get the true test and all to integrate, but I think that's a lot better now. I mean, we do most of our stuff based off Excel, but the general off-the-shelf stuff through Gallagher, True Test, Breed Elite, it's all pretty good stuff. And if you're using any farm management systems, most of it can start to integrate now. So AgriWebs can bring it all in and utilise that data pretty well. So it's definitely a lot better. Even the last couple of years, I think it's gone a long way. So
Yeah, just on the tag thing, I'll just elaborate a little bit. So first, I think we did over 2,000 ewe hoggets in 2014. They were a strap tag with a fairly thin pin that was pretty easy to shear off. And this is as a 1.5. We were tying them on with cable ties as they were coming out the shearing shed virtually just on the first read. Now, the ability to then go back, if you've got to do that the first year and use that data at any point later on, is going to be pretty hard. So then we went to one where the pin is in the chip is actually in the pin. I can't get that into a shearing comb, so can't shear it off. But they're so big and high that we were ripping them off in trough float covers and stock crates and all sorts. But yeah, we're with Shearwell now as well, and they've got a thin pin, but I think because they fit so close to the ear, you can't actually the shearing the blade the comb doesn't get between the tag and the ear to start with. So that's been pretty good.
We found like we were actually cleaning our troughs and we'd be finding tags in the troughs at times. It was pretty at $1.50 or $1.60 a throw was hurting a bit, and you're starting to wonder question where you're at. But we haven't had any problems this last 12 months. It's been really good.
Yeah, with those it wasn't only hurting us, it was hurting the sheep. We're finding the whole of the year in the trough sometimes.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
The other comment was don't be scared about collecting more data than you think you're going to need, because like going into the 2018-19 drought situation, if you've got that hogget data and it's really easy, it's all stored, you may not expect to ever use it after the hogget classing, but all of a sudden the top 20%, even out of your 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds, rather than selling down from the top, you're better off keeping the top 20% of your flock going into that drought, feeding them whatever, because you won't be able to get them back. And they're probably the ones you really want to rebuild from. That's my only other comment. So sometimes you don't know why you're collecting the data, but store it. Same with yield maps for cropping.
Yeah, exactly. And we're trying to bring that sort of mentality out of that yield mapping or whatever into the sheep job. And we're pretty bad for it at home. We collect a lot of stuff. If we've got, sometimes we'll just, not so much. Like for instance, we've got a theory, or it's not a theory, but it's just a subjective thing where if we're scanning and every poor shedder we see always seems to have twins in it. So going through and just marking those down to see if there's anything in that and trying to bring it back to something a bit more structured. Then I think sometimes the narrative that we've got in our brain, we try and find things to justify it with that and trying to get away from that a little bit. But the amount of data you can get, you can simplify it pretty easily. Like we managed to do it in cropping with taking imagery and converting it to CSV files that are massive data sets, and you can bring it back when you index back to something quite meaningful and really structured and playing around with it. I mean, for me, with data, it's sometimes it's nice to be able to go and sit in the office of a night time or first thing in the morning without a heap of dogs or agents or whatever in the background trying to influence the decision and actually to get a bit more structured about what you're doing. And that's one thing I've found with clients that we get, particularly once it gets dry, we start to think, oh, bugger, it's not raining, and then we just lose that bit of structure and bit of governance in what we're doing in the business. So by having that bit more sort of input into our decision making, we tend to get a little bit better decisions, and we're not sending those ewes or females away that are that are never going to perform anyways, and particularly with mutton prices as much as lamb at the moment, like it's pretty hard for me to justify keeping some of those ewes on that are never going to get lambs, that are never going to perform anyways. You may as well cash them in and cash a couple in and buy some better high performing ewes or females back in, as far as I'm concerned. So that's one thing we're focused on pretty heavily.
Any more from the floor before we on to the next one? All right, thanks, Lachie.
Cheers.